Okay. Um, this is the last part of part three. I was interrupted before I could finish the section or the third part of part three or second part of part three. Um, Let me start where I stopped. We were in Hungary and we were in a train station, and a guardian angel of sorts saved us. Or was this the new man the Soviets had talked about or the communists had talked about years ago? True to his word, Georgi Bakunin gave the three strangers at the station, including myself, those of us from North and South America, the keys to his flat for the next 4 days. He just gave it to us. We'd never met the guy before. In an area far outside of town, we took the commuter line to Pest. Soon, Georgi disappeared into the night, leaving his phone number by the telephone at the apartment in one of the rooms, along with a map to help us find our way back to the city to enjoy the next few days. On our last night in Buda, Georgi met us again. He was supposed to bring his girlfriend, but he didn't. He met the three of us for the coffee at the famous Cafe New York, which was certainly an honor for anyone who has been there to drink and to listen to music in that city under the Danube. Um, uh, there was wonderful blues and jazz that night in other parts of town. Georgi and I uh, said goodbye to the Brazilian and Argentinian couple because they were leaving on the train very early the next morning. I had no intention to do so. They also were saving money. I noted that uh, Brazilian and Argentinian Jewish couple were very short on money and had been sleeping in trains almost the whole month of their Eurail pass. Finally, for Westerners, the evening was relatively inexpensive. So coming from West Germany, even though I was on a student's budget, I could still enjoy it night out in a snazzy cafe. I left Budapest the next morning after sharing red, green, and yellow paprika with the Hungarian Bakunin in his kitchen. As we ate the simple vegetable for breakfast, I recall all the jokes about paprika and goulash communism I had heard over the past year. Next, like a guardian angel, Georgi took me back to the Buda station. Inside the station, we observed more passengers from all over Eastern Europe. They were napping out near the platform and in various corners of the station. George, George or Giorgio, Georgi made it clear to me that this Hungarian was helping me out. We could have ended up like them, sleeping in the station, is what he was saying. Uh, I did not have to leave and live and sleep in the station like gypsies. I could sleep at his house. As I boarded the train to Sopron, I asked myself whether, in fact, the man Georgi Bakunin, who I just met, uh, was what the theory of socialism, communism talked about as the new man. Uh, and I remembered years ago when I heard the phrase new man for the first time. I was in Nicaragua. I had seen glimpses of this new man, of socialism in Sandinista early years before things got really dirty there in 1983. I recall that I and the tour I was on with an international development class from Bethel College uh, went to an open air prison farm. There at the farm, we met a man, a former Somoza Army officer who had been sentenced to nearly 19 years of prison. But on this particular government project, this prison had no walls and the prisoners were free to come and go as they pleased, as long as they demonstrated the ideals of living as a new man in the Sandinista world. That particular prisoner was an ex-Somocista officer, possibly a general. He was at least a colonel. He was hoping for early release. He was able to get visits from his family on the farm, and occasionally he could go home and stay with them, uh, depending on how he acted and how he treated his fellow man at the farm. You believe that? Oh no. Hungarian Georgi wasn't necessarily an example of communism's new man, maybe. He'd shown his Western hard, what do they call it, Protestant work ethic style, or uh, in his trip, he told me to Paris some years ago. He was sent by the telecom along with other colleagues to study the Paris telecommunication system and how things function there. And his friends just spent the time drinking and laughing and not really learning, while he spent time studying how things function in the West. Uh, and he was so gung ho that eventually he became, after the wall came down, a full time camera specialist. And when the Gorbachev was kidnapped in 1991, the Hungarian uh, people, such as himself, were some of the first ones to go over and film for CNN what was happening live, and it was shown around the world. Georgi's spirit or demeanor, though, was saying, "Let me share my home with you. I'll share my homeland with you. Here are the keys to my abode. Enjoy Budapest and my country, Hungary. Trust. Don't be afraid of us." It would be such a demeanor of naive trust in humanity and hope for a better future, which I would often miss after the revolutions of 1989 when I have visited Eastern Europe. On the other hand, there is still something in the air at times of this trusting humaneness, which most of us from the West will hardly ever experience again on our travels elsewhere or even in our homelands. Perhaps it is like a small but closed community in which one feels a sense of safety or Geborgenheit, lightness of being, as one is taken care of in a somewhat patriarchal manner. That is, I am certain that this trusting way and hopefulness for the best in man demeanor is something that continues to spawn a reversal towards parochialism and nostalgia for the pre 1989 world in Eastern Europe. This nostalgia is something which many Eastern Europeans are still directly or indirectly passing on to their progeny. Note, its most negative manifestation, parochialism, leads to an us versus them or xenophobia and misdirected anger. That's something to worry about. But on the other hand, it can be beautiful. Incidentally, the location where I crossed the border into Austria from Sopron, Hungary, later that September 1987 day after leaving Gheorghe at the station, was exactly where the barbed wire fence would be taken down 2 years later in May 1989. It was this wide open border between Austria and Hungary, which would offer an opening for thousands of Eastern Germans to leave their homeland for the West that summer of 1989. In short, the march toward the collapse of communism throughout Europe was spawned to a large extent in the hearts and practices of goulash communism throughout the 1980s. In summary, the openness, friendliness, and tolerance of Hungary, situated as it was in Central Europe, was bound to lead to changes in the openness and tolerance of all the bordering states. Let me continue. In Moscow of January 1989, I was there before the revolution of that year. In the year after I visited Hungary, another region of Europe with language isolates, Hungarian is a language isolate, the Baltic states began to throw off the Soviet yoke. I'd been reading about this in the news throughout 1988. I determined to fly to the Soviet Union in January of 1989 to find out what kind of attitudes people in Russia had towards these changes going on around them in both Eastern Europe and China, as well as learning about their thoughts on changes going on within their own Soviet Federation. Meanwhile, um, I should say, over the prior 2 years, Latvia had quietly moved into revolutionary footing through a hidden position under the banner of ecology and environmentalism. This movement to ostensibly support the Latvian environmental demands eventually became a full-fledged independence movement. Yes, environmentalism can lead to revolution. Note, in the 1980s, similar peace, reform, and independence movements in East Germany and Eastern Europe were able to function, often hiding under the umbrella of either the church or under the umbrella of environmentalism or both. The terrible Chernobyl disaster in April 1986 had made a huge dent in the psyche of even strict Soviet leadership. So in February 1987, an environmental protection club was formed in Latvia to stop the Soviet Union from building a huge hydroelectric dam. The Soviet leaderships allowed this movement in opposition to the dam project to meet freely and openly. Soon, that uh, group and the other environmental clubs were able to join with still more others, including the commemoration of the deportation group of 1941. I should say in 1941, after the Baltics had been given to the Soviet Union through the 1939 occupation, there were many massacres and abuses in Latvia. And of course, the Soviets didn't want them celebrating that, but it became tied in with the environmental movement. This protest in Latvia memorialized the takeover of Latvia, and the unprecedented event in other Balkan states began to happen too. Uh, Meanwhile, the Soviet Union began to lose control of its own demagogues. I'd already witnessed or read about Boris Yeltsin, uh, who in mid-February 1988 was dismissed from his communist leadership by Gorbachev himself. Um, I, in an unheard of comeback, though, the populist Boris Yeltsin would soon be elected in early 1989, just a month or so after I left um, um, Moscow again. He would become the leader of Moscow region himself with 90% of the popular vote. In the meantime, a very vocal Boris Yeltsin had spoken up many times in the years prior to this and in 1989 on the need for greater speed in the reform efforts of the Soviet system. In other words, he felt too that there would be a collapse if things did not move faster. My visit to the evil empire's capital city, Moscow, in January 1989 it occurred during one of the warmest winters in recent memory. This warmth provided metaphorical sense for a thaw that was occurring all over as the Cold War came to its surprising end that year. It was so warm that January 1989, I was able to go for a daily swim in winter in the huge round, they're circular, outdoor swimming pools. I think they were 100 meters across. Um, and it was completely round, and there was steam everywhere. And you can imagine many secret meetings being taken place in such a place like that in winter. So all this steam coming off the hot pools, and people could enjoy that warmth. At that time in the late 1980s, this outdoor pool was still the largest swimming pool in the world. It was certainly the largest heated swimming pool ever built. The warm waters of the steaming pool was a place for people of all classes. They had classes, yes, or wealth levels or connection levels, whatever you want to call it, in the Soviet Union. I recall simply leaving my clothes there, though, in a corner, with my wallet in a plastic bag at the edge of the pool, and I was told no one would take it. And that's the way it was in Moscow back in 1989. I had been invited to swim that 32-degree Fahrenheit evening by a Muscovite named Igor, who had been showing us around town. A friend of mine on the tour had known Igor through correspondences and had introduced me to him. Over several nights, we peppered Igor with a variety of questions. I recall being specifically interested in the future of the multi-state Soviet Union at that time. That is, I was fairly interested in what Igor had to say about the future of his own Soviet Russia, the largest of the communist republics making up the USSR. Prior to arriving in Moscow, I had read several articles on the potential breakup, not just of the Soviet Empire, but also of the great landmass of Russia, a nation which, alongside India and China, make up three mammoth-sized multicultural states in Asia. Upon arriving at our Moscow hotel at the outskirts of the capital of the USSR, I'd been impressed and thoughtful of the many very Asian-looking Russians who I saw around me. They all were dressed like the same Russian image we have of fur hats on their heads and the dark clothing, but they were very, very Asian-looking. I thought Korean. How could these Korean-looking people be Russian? Do they feel more or less Russian when visiting Moscow? Do they feel more or less part of the Soviet Union? What of the Chinese and Mongolian looking folks? Are they integrated? Do they feel part of the same federation or state? How about those Muslims from the various Soviet and Russian stands, such as Dagestan or Turkmenistan? Igor assured me, from our perspective here in Moscow, so close to Europe, we see ourselves as European. However, many of the other Russians, including those in Siberia and eastwards, do not. Igor added, as a matter of fact, we don't really understand each other. Igor went so far as envisioning a rump Russia of sorts in his nation's future, where the Western or European Russians split off into their own country. I challenged Igor. How could he say that? How could that be? You know, for example, in the eastern part of the country of Russia is where they have gas and oil reserves. And I'm sure that the Russian West would not give that up. Igor nodded, but also countered. In fact, this disillusionment might ultimately be possible because, in a nutshell, we see the world so differently. That is, we in the West, Western Russia, certainly think much differently than those in the other corners of Russia. On my last night in Moscow, at least my last 2 nights, I ventured out into other parts of the city on my own. The first night, I ran into some young people in their 20s. They were university students. One pretty young woman said she had studied fashion design and would love to leave Russia and to study fashion while working in Italy. Some of the other students had similar dreams. I don't know if the woman was proposing to me or not, but she evidently was going to get to the West and follow her dreams no matter what. None of these people are young students seem to be very interested in the Soviet system as they desired to move west. They were more ready to talk about investors and capitalists at that time. I bought these younger and poorer students some hamburgers, and these young Russians introduced me to cognac. That's right, not vodka, but cognac. You see, these young people were not interested in the things in Russia again, or its great past. They were only focused on the West. I had to admit that the French cognac had much better taste to it than the vodka. Even after eating a few tiny Western hamburgers cooked a la Moskova, I could still taste the cognac and had a taste for it ever since. Similarly, I had to admit not being impressed as they were, and they laughed about the People's Department Store. It's called GUM. It's across the street from the Kremlin and had been famous for decades as a place where opulence could be found in the Soviet Union. GUM stands for the State Department Store in Russia, and the Neo-Russian building had been constructed to be a window to the West in terms of both Russian and later Soviet wealth and production. Alas, by the 1980s, what GUM had to offer was little more than a bad joke of anachronism and low quality. It had much less to offer than a market in Tijuana, Mexico, for example. Admittedly, babushkas were still cheap and they were in good condition. You see, just like the East Berlin that I'd come to know after several visits, Muscovites had to spend a lot of time in long lines just to get basic necessities, and twice that much time or more to obtain the occasional non-essential gifts or curiosities. For example, bananas were almost non-existent in Soviet and East German stores. These kinds of fruits grew only in warm climates and thus required hard currency generally for their purchase. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. In summary, consumption drive would drive change for youth in Eastern Europe. The products in the East were usually substandard and at best clunky as compared to what people in the West could afford or could find in the marketplace. Even people in poorer developing lands like Peru or Indonesia often had better quality goods available to them than was often found in Soviet and communist dictated planned economies. The only way Soviet citizens could buy Western products was generally through using Western currency or gold. In Eastern Germany, the stores to go to for Western goods were called Intershop. The name Intershop means, in the mix of English and Latin, to convey a foreign concept of trade for goods and services. Incidentally, these stores were run by the state themselves in order for the state, the communist state, to acquire as much Western currency as possible. Not too far from where the GUM was located at the Kremlin was St. Basil's Church, and from the church you could see or basilica, you could see the bridge over the Mokba River. At the far end of the bridge, one could easily exchange Western currency illegally for Soviet rubles. I was thinking to myself, how can this be? We're just right across the street from the Kremlin, and you're allowed, or down the street from the Kremlin, and you can change rubles so openly. The bridge was large and was one of several places in town where currency exchanges could take place well below the official Soviet rate. In retrospect, one has to suspect that this sort of exchange of currencies with dark, plain clothed figures on a bridge in obvious sight of the Kremlin was continuously allowed to occur because it was good for someone with connection at the Kremlin, or two, it was at least a good place for police, military, and KGB officers or families to simply exchange their own money as well, and they didn't want to change the system. In other words, it was a pressure valve. You could let out some pressure, people could get a few things, they could change their somehow received money and get some Western money in exchange. As I left Moscow in January 1989 to return to West Germany, I had an inkling that the evil empire and supposedly formidable imperial Soviet Union and its citizens were ready to cut and run from their past. 1 month later, in February 1989, the Soviet Union would begin its pullout from Afghanistan, ending that portion of its expansive history. I want to give a kind of epilogue here. Unlike the USA, which had been defeated in Vietnam in 1975 and elsewhere over the decades in small skirmishes like in Mexico 1916, in Nicaragua 1933, the Soviet bear would not rise from the grave it had dug in Afghanistan. Within a few short months after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the entire western half of the Warsaw Pact would begin to move en masse towards the west in order to seek a new future in Europe, especially as consumers of goods and services and new ideas. Many Muscovites would have liked to have followed me back to Germany and to the West. Some would, and some have. Now, 20 or 30 years after the revolutionary year of 1989, I have returned to Germany several times, one time to teach young college students. When I did, I found students in my classes, English and business classes, German students from Russia, from Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, Eastern Germany, former Yugoslavia states, including Croatia. In other words, the move west has transformed Europe, and that's the real revolution, just moving towards the west, and of course the west towards the east since 1989. Over most of the past century, this has been the case, but with 1985, this change began anew. What I mean is, through much of the 20th century, there was this movement of East and West, and maybe over millennia, East and West mixing in Central Europe. But in 1989, the frozen world of the Warsaw Pact came to an end. Note, immigration has been a primary force shaping democratic developments in the two Germanys in the post-war period. After the erection of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the immigration flow, first into West Germany and later into United Germany, consisted mainly of workers from Southern Europe because of this closing. In addition, the immigrants included several other groups, a small but steady stream of East German immigrants called Übersiedler during the 1980s that exploded in size in 1990 to nearly 400,000 people. But by 1993 had fallen to less than half that. And this was all offset by movement from west to east when several million ethnic Germans, isolated from Eastern Europe, especially the Soviet Union, also began to move, and others went to look for work in their place, in their countries. Um, in Wiesbaden, where I taught a few years ago in Germany, by contrast, the reality on the ground was quite obvious. Um, there were Russians, Moldovians, Ukrainians, Eastern Germans, Polish, Czechoslovakians, or Laotians, all in my church, just in my church. And my church was small, less than maybe 60 people, 70 people maybe. In contrast to this reality on the ground, at the time I lived in West Germany in the 1980s, I had been told by my German girlfriend at the time, with great confidence, that only blood Germans would ever be allowed citizenship here. However, by the late 1990s, this law was changed in Germany. Perhaps this change in immigration and integration practices in Western Europe has been the greatest legacy of the revolutions of 1989. Thank you for watching this, and please consider supporting this YouTube channel, or coming back and watching more programs on this topic, as well as other oral histories. This is Kevin Stoda. Have a good day.